You ever notice how people say, I just don't understand why I'm broke, right after dropping $7.50 on a pumpkin spice latte and crying over their student debt like it's a personality trait? Yeah, that. See, we've built a world where feelings matter more than facts, where I feel like housing should be affordable is supposed to change the laws of supply and demand, where people think they're oppressed because Uber Eats is late. You want to fix the world? First, fix the way you think about it. That's where this book kicks you in the mental teeth. Introduction. The book is Economic Facts and Fallacies by the intellectual street fighter himself, Thomas Sowell. And if you don't know who he is, congratulations. You've been failed by the education system and your TikTok feed. Sowell isn't just an economist. He's the intellectual equivalent of a mic drop, a data-slinging, nonsense-destroying, logic-loaded assassin who writes with the grace of a poet and the accuracy of a sniper. The book, a straight-up demolition derby of bad ideas. It takes aim at all the sacred cows of modern society: gender wage gaps, income inequality, rent control, racial disparities, education myths, and calmly explains why most of what you think you know is dead wrong. It's not a comforting bedtime story. It's the wake-up call you've been ignoring because it doesn't come with a trigger warning. Sowell doesn't care if you're liberal or conservative. He doesn't care if you cry when the numbers hurt your feelings. What he cares about is truth, backed by evidence, history, and a dangerous amount of common sense. This isn't a book for people who want to be coddled. It's for people who want to stop being intellectually lazy. And if that's not you, put the book down and go back to arguing with strangers online. We'll be going chapter by chapter, extracting every brutal truth and every sacred belief this book unapologetically sets on fire. And you're gonna love it, or at least learn something before rage quitting. Welcome to Mindful Reads Hub. Let's get started. Chapter 1. The Power of Fallacies. You ever try arguing with someone who thinks feelings are facts? You show them data and they come back with, well, that's not my experience. Congratulations, you just walked into the intellectual equivalent of a toddler screaming in Walmart because they can't have candy. Welcome to the real world, where facts don't care if they match your vibes. And in this world, economic fallacies are running wild like TikTok trends, contagious, annoying, and dangerously stupid. Thomas Sowell isn't having it. In this chapter, he lines up the most common and seductive fallacies that people, especially academics, politicians, and well-meaning but misinformed folks, use to justify bad policy and even worse logic. These aren't just innocent misunderstandings. These are mental malware infecting everything from your local school board to Congress. Sowell's goal? Burn them to the ground. First up is the zero-sum fallacy. This one's a fan favorite among the Twitter mob, and anyone who thinks someone else's success means they were robbed. In the zero-sum universe, the economy is like a fixed pie. If Jeff Bezos gets a bigger slice, it must mean you get less. But here's the rub. The pie isn't fixed. It grows. Wealth can be created. Productivity isn't theft. Sowell points out that this fallacy leads people to fight against trade, capitalism, and basically anything that produces actual prosperity. Because when you see gain as theft, you punish winners and worship victims. Sound familiar? Then we get hit with the fallacy of composition. This is what happens when people assume what's true for the part is true for the whole. Example: if one person stands up at a concert, they can see better. So if everyone stands up, everyone will see better. Genius, right? Or try this in economics. Raising wages for one group helps them, so let's raise everyone's wages everywhere by law. Boom. Unemployment. Congratulations, you've just logicked your way into a recession. Sowell shows how this kind of thinking tanks entire economies, especially when people start treating every individual action as scalable. Spoiler alert, it's not. Now let's talk about post hoc fallacy, or as it's known on social media, I saw a thing happen, then another thing, so the first thing must have caused the second. This is the logical sleight of hand people use when they say, crime went down after gun control, so gun control works. But they ignore literally everything else that happened during that time. Sowell calls this intellectual laziness on steroids. If your logic can't survive without ignoring every other variable, it's not logic, it's propaganda with a self-esteem complex. Next victim, the chess pieces fallacy. If you've ever listened to someone talk about designing a better society, you've seen this one. This fallacy assumes people are passive objects to be moved around by enlightened planners. Politicians love this. Let's relocate people from this neighborhood to that one. Let's raise this group's income and lower that group's taxes. It's all theory until you realize people aren't pawns. They have their own goals, habits, cultures, histories. Central planning assumes the world is a SimCity map, and Sowell tears it apart with the fury of someone who's actually read a history book. And finally, the open-ended fallacy. This is the fatal belief that if something is good, we must keep doing it, no matter the cost. Like, education is good, so let's spend unlimited money on it forever. Or, healthcare is important, so let's give it to everyone, no matter the consequences. Sowell isn't anti-help, he's anti-stupidity. Every resource has an opportunity cost. Every dollar you throw at one problem is a dollar you're not using elsewhere. That's not cruelty, that's basic adult decision making. Throughout this opening chapter, Sowell is less concerned with your ideology and more concerned with your logic, or lack thereof. His whole point is this: fallacies feel good. They flatter our emotions, they confirm our biases, but if we keep building policy on them, we'll end up broke, bitter, and bewildered about why nothing works. This chapter isn't just a warning, it's a mirror. And if you don't like what you see, maybe stop defending your dumb beliefs like they're your grandma's honor. You want to change the world? Start by fixing the way you think. Stop sharing cute graphics from activist accounts that fail Econ 101. Start asking hard questions and stop pretending your feelings are facts. Because as Sowell shows, reality doesn't bend to your narrative. It just quietly punishes your ignorance. Key takeaway: fallacies aren't just innocent mistakes. They're dangerous lies we tell ourselves to feel smarter, more virtuous, or more victimized. If you don't destroy them, they'll destroy your ability to understand the world and ruin it while they're at it. Quote to slap on your mental fridge: the real problem is not that people are ignorant. The problem is that they know so much that isn't so. Chapter 2. Urban Facts and Fallacies. Let's get something straight. Cities aren't broken because of overpopulation, greedy landlords, or too many cars. They're broken because a bunch of clueless planners, social engineers, and utopia addicts decided they knew better than economic reality. In this chapter, Sowell makes it painfully clear that the people shaping our cities don't understand cities, and worse, they don't care. If you think traffic jams are caused by people owning too many cars, congratulations, you're part of the problem. Sowell exposes the idiocy of assuming you can solve congestion by banning cars from downtown, like in Kalamazoo or Buffalo, where cities shut down traffic to build pedestrian malls. The result? Skyrocketing business failures, boarded up shops, and downtowns that look like zombie movies. But these planners didn't lose their jobs. No, they got awards. Because failure only matters when you're accountable, which bureaucrats and academics never are. Sowell delivers a savage truth. Congestion happens because streets are free to use. You think you're saving the planet driving on government-funded roads? Nope. You're just freeloading on a system that guarantees gridlock. Cities like Singapore and Stockholm figured this out. Charge people to use congested roads, and guess what? People adjust, traffic moves, air quality improves. Revolutionary, huh? Not to the geniuses in US city halls still trying to get people out of cars by making life miserable. And don't even start with mass transit is the answer. Sowell eviscerates this fantasy with facts. You can dump billions into buses and trains, but unless you're packing people like sardines in a Tokyo subway, it's not gonna work. Why? Because mass transit only makes sense in places with insane population density, and most cities ain't Manhattan. The average suburbanite needs a car. They don't want to walk 20 minutes to a bus stop so they can transfer twice and still be late for work. But planners don't care what works. They care about control. Speaking of control, let's talk housing. If you believe affordable housing comes from more government programs, you've got the cause and effect completely backwards. Sowell points out that housing used to be affordable. Really. Back before every city slapped smart growth, open space, and historic preservation restrictions on everything that moves. In California, the state where you need a second mortgage to afford a shed, 3/4 of the land is off limits to development. Prices skyrocket not because of market greed, but because artificial scarcity makes land more valuable than gold. And rent control? Don't even try to defend that. Rent control is economic cyanide disguised as compassion. It's been tried in New York, Cairo, Hanoi, and Stockholm. And guess what? Every time it leads to housing shortages, crumbling buildings, and tenants begging for basic repairs. If you pay landlords peanuts and outlaw evictions, they stop maintaining buildings. Basic logic. But logic doesn't matter when you've got a sob story to sell. Politicians can say they fought for tenants, even while turning entire neighborhoods into hellholes. Then there's the myth of revitalization, aka bulldozing poor neighborhoods to build overpriced condos. Politicians call this progress. Sowell calls it what it is, a zero-sum con. They're not creating wealth, they're just displacing people. You knock down low-income housing, put up some glittering apartments, and pretend the city got richer. But the poor didn't vanish. They just moved somewhere else, now even worse off. It's gentrification by virtue signal. And don't even think about blaming suburbs. The elite's new favorite trend is demonizing suburbia as wasteful, racist, and car-dependent. But Sowell shuts that down fast. Suburbs didn't kill cities. Cities killed themselves. Suburbs exploded because people were fleeing crime, dysfunction, and sky-high taxes. Want people to come back? Maybe start by making cities livable instead of treating every taxpayer like a walking ATM. What this chapter drives home, again and again, is that the biggest threat to cities isn't capitalism. It's control freaks who ignore economics and punish success. Urban policies driven by emotion, politics, and ideology don't just fail, they cause lasting damage. Entire generations are stuck in housing crises, transit nightmares, and regulatory webs built by people who think market is a dirty word. You want vibrant cities? Sowell's advice is brutal and simple. Get out of the way. Let supply and demand work. Let people drive, build, move, rent, and live like adults. And stop pretending government interventions that caused the mess can now magically clean it up. Key takeaway. The disaster of modern urban policy comes not from markets failing, but from the arrogance of central planners who think they can outsmart reality. You don't fix cities by choking off supply and calling it sustainability. You fix them by unleashing the forces that actually built cities in the first place: freedom, choice, and competition. Chapter quote, "Mistakes like that can last for generations." Chapter 3, Male and Female Facts and Fallacies. You want equality? Great. Start by getting rid of the junk science, the cherry-picked stats, and the because patriarchy slogans passed off as analysis. This chapter is a slap across the face to anyone who's ever reduced the complex dance of gender economics to a viral tweet or campus protest chant. Thomas Sowell doesn't just poke holes in the gender wage gap narrative, he brings a blowtorch. First up, let's kill the sacred cow. Women earn 77 cents for every dollar a man earns. Yeah, so what? That's not evidence of discrimination, that's evidence of lazy thinking. Sowell takes this claim and grinds it through a meat processor of context. He shows that wage differences vanish, or even flip, when you control for actual variables like age, hours worked, occupation, education, and experience. You know, the things that matter in the real world. Not just in op-eds and grievance studies departments. Here's the thing, men and women make different choices. Not worse, not better, different. And those choices have consequences. Men work more hours. Women interrupt careers for children. Men dominate risk-heavy jobs like construction, oil rigs, and law enforcement. Women lean toward roles that prioritize flexibility, stability, and social value, like nursing or teaching. But no, let's all pretend the economy is some patriarchal conspiracy where CEOs meet in secret and go, let's screw women today. Historically, Sowell digs in deep and shows that women in earlier eras were not forced out of the workforce. They opted out because the trade-off between work and home mattered. And let's not pretend women weren't working. They were. But in family farms, home-based enterprises, and unpaid labor that modern stats don't count, which means judging 19th century women by 21st century feminist standards isn't just arrogant, it's ignorant. And speaking of ignorance, how about the constant trope that women have to work twice as hard to get half as far? Sowell brings receipts. When you match men and women on actual job characteristics, earnings become nearly identical. In fact, unmarried women without children in major cities now out-earn their male counterparts. Oops, guess patriarchy forgot to show up for work that day. Then there's the idea that employers are all just sexist dinosaurs, turning down hyper-qualified women because of some outdated gender bias. Really? So, in a competitive market, these business owners are just volunteering to lose money because they don't like ovaries? That's the kind of economic illiteracy you need a PhD in grievance studies to believe. Sowell reminds us that in any functioning market, discrimination costs money. If you pass over a qualified woman just to hire a less competent man, you're paying a premium to indulge your prejudice, and competitors who hire purely on merit will eat your lunch. But don't get it twisted. Sowell isn't saying sexism doesn't exist. He's saying it can't explain the wage gap, career gaps, or leadership gaps on its own. Not when you factor in choices. Not when women take more time off, avoid overtime-heavy jobs, and prioritize family more often than men. These are trends, not universals. Exceptions exist, but policy based on exceptions is just bad math dressed up as virtue. And, oh boy, he absolutely obliterates the myth that gender outcomes are supposed to be 50-50. If outcomes differ, activists scream discrimination as if math were oppression, but different groups making different choices will always produce unequal results. Equality of opportunity does not guarantee equality of outcome, unless you believe people are interchangeable Lego blocks, which of course is what the modern bureaucratic mind seems to think. Sowell doesn't stop there. He points to history. Women entering law and medicine didn't result in disaster. It led to better options, more talent, and greater economic efficiency. But that shift didn't happen because of government mandates. It happened because women gained access to education, flexibility, and career planning. Reality adapted, not because it was forced to, but because it was profitable to do so. This chapter isn't a war cry for traditionalism. It's a war cry for facts. And the fact is, using cooked stats to paint women as victims undermines the very achievements feminism claims to champion. When you flatten all complexity into men bad, women oppressed, you insult both genders, and you sure as hell don't fix anything. Key takeaway: the wage gap isn't proof of discrimination, it's proof that life is messy, choices matter, and simplistic narratives should die in a fire. You want equality? Great. Let's start by being honest about the numbers and stop demanding that the real world conform to ideological fantasy. Quote to drop at your next fake deep panel on gender equity. It is by no means certain that most women would prefer to be bricklayers rather than secretaries if pay and conditions were equal. Thomas Sowell, reminding us that choice matters more than utopia. Chapter 4. Academic Facts and Fallacies. Here's a question. If universities are so full of brilliant people, how come the institutions themselves are so consistently bloated, inefficient, and clueless? That's the question Sowell brutally answers in this chapter. And if you've ever paid $80,000 for a gender studies degree and ended up working at Starbucks, buckle up. This one's for you. Let's start by calling out the grand illusion that higher education is some sacred space of rational thought and enlightened progress. No, it's a business, a messy, politicized, taxpayer-fattened, prestige-hungry business. And in typical Sowell fashion, he slices through the ivory tower's velvet curtain and exposes the self-serving incentives, corrupt governance, and straight-up economic stupidity that define modern academia. First target, academic governance. Universities are not run by business-savvy adults or educational visionaries. They're run by committees of academics whose expertise often has nothing to do with management, finance, or organizational structure. Imagine letting a panel of medieval literature professors design your company's budget strategy, and somehow being surprised when it crashes and burns. This is what passes for leadership in higher ed. The incentives are all wrong. These people are rewarded not for efficiency or real-world outcomes, but for publishing unread articles and securing government grants. You could run a university into the ground and still get tenure. Sowell points out that faculty power can be even worse, because tenure is basically an economic straitjacket. You can't be fired no matter how lazy, politically biased, or professionally irrelevant you become. That's not job security, that's economic malpractice. And when tenured radicals start treating the classroom like an indoctrination center instead of a place for critical thought, don't be shocked. This system was built to protect the ideologues, not the students. And let's talk about the students, or more accurately, the customers who are lied to daily. Sowell shows that the typical student pays tens of thousands of dollars for a credential that may or may not lead to anything meaningful, because nobody stops to ask whether the education matches market demand. It's not about whether your degree helps you contribute to society. It's about whether the university can collect your tuition and pretend you're now educated. What's worse, administrators inflate grades, dumb down curricula, and pile on safe space programming instead of actual intellectual rigor. You're not being challenged, you're being sedated, and God help you if you question the costs. Academic costs have skyrocketed because universities are spending your tuition on luxury dorms, DEI bureaucracies, and six-figure salaries for vice presidents of things nobody can define. It's like a luxury resort mixed with a cult, and you're footing the bill. As Sowell explains, this isn't a response to student demand. It's a byproduct of unlimited government loans and the absence of accountability. If students were paying out of pocket, you bet your overpriced textbooks this nonsense would end tomorrow. Meanwhile, academic revenues don't come from excellence. They come from government subsidies, alumni donations, fueled by guilt or nostalgia, and of course, tuition that rises faster than inflation on steroids. And who gets punished when the institution underperforms? No one. Universities get bailed out or rebranded. Professors keep publishing useless research in obscure journals, and clueless graduates get to post degrees on Instagram while applying for internships at age 29. The worst part? It's all wrapped in virtue. Sowell dismantles the idea that academia is some pure-hearted guardian of truth. Please, it's a place where ideology matters more than inquiry, where dogma is masked as critical theory, and where facts that offend are censored instead of examined. Diversity of opinion? Not if you're a conservative economist. Intellectual humility? Not when you've spent your entire adult life in a bubble where disagreement is violence. Academic institutions are no longer places where you go to expand your mind. They're places you go to pay for the privilege of being indoctrinated, then gaslit into thinking you're enlightened. And Thomas Sowell, with ruthless precision, lays bare how this happened, why it continues, and how we're all footing the bill for an empire of BS dressed up in Latin phrases and graduation robes. Key takeaway: academia is not failing because of underfunding or oppression. It's failing because it is structurally incentivized to be inefficient, ideologically biased, and economically unsustainable. You're not undereducated, you're overcharged. Quote that should be carved into every university gate: there is a fundamental difference between education and credentialing, and academic institutions have blurred that line for profit. Chapter 5: Income Facts and Fallacies. If there's a single chapter where Sowell takes a rhetorical sledgehammer to the jawbone of public stupidity, it's this one. Income Facts and Fallacies is Thomas Sowell grabbing the economic fairy tales about inequality, wringing their necks, and hanging their limp corpses for all to see. If you came here to have your tender illusions cuddled and reassured, you are definitely in the wrong zip code. Right out of the gate, Sowell savages the delusion that income is a static thing, a fixed, frozen identity that people are nailed into like insects on a board. He points out, with unrelenting aggression, that most Americans do not stay in the same income bracket for their entire lives. The people in the bottom 20% at one given moment are often in the top 20% at another point in their lives. Translation: the poor today are often the rich tomorrow, and vice versa, because, brace yourself, people are not statues. They move, they learn, they hustle, they age, they marry, they divorce, they change jobs. The idea of taking a snapshot at one moment and pretending that's the permanent story of the poor is not just wrong, it's intellectually criminal. Sowell takes particular delight, the kind of delight a cat must feel playing with a doomed mouse, in wrecking the income stagnation myth. The left, he sneers, loves to cherry-pick misleading statistics that show wages stagnating since the 1970s. Except, inconveniently, that's often measuring households, not individuals, in a world where household sizes have shrunk dramatically. Or it's comparing apples to oranges. The people counted as poor decades ago were very different groups from today's poor. Meanwhile, real per capita income has risen significantly. Technology, living standards, medical advances, those don't seem to get a starring role in the doom and gloom theatre. And if you think you're safe because you believe the story about income inequality, Sowell has you in his sights too. Income inequality, he argues, is largely irrelevant because people are not widgets produced on an assembly line. People are different, they make different choices, they have different talents, they even, shocking he knows, have different priorities. The idea that it's some moral outrage that brain surgeons and burger flippers don't make the same amount of money is not a call for justice, it's a call for insanity. A particularly brutal moment comes when Sowell rips into the sacred cow of CEO pay. Yes, it's a lot. No, it's not proof of capitalism's evil. Sowell methodically explains that high compensation for CEOs is not about greed. It's about the massive leverage a good or bad CEO has over multi-billion-dollar enterprises. If a CEO's decisions can swing the valuation of a company by billions, paying them millions is just math, not theft. It costs less to pay a first-rate executive top dollar than to suffer the consequences of a third-rate executive at bargain prices. There's also an entertaining curb stomp of the obsession with the rich getting richer. Sowell emphasizes that wealth is not a zero-sum game. The real question is not whether the rich are getting richer, he says, but whether the poor are doing better. And they are. It's an unmistakable jab at a society obsessed with envy rather than improvement. Growth in absolute living standards, not relative comparisons fueled by envy, should be the focus. He also nukes the notion that discrimination explains income gaps between groups. Historical facts, that oh-so-inconvenient thing the professional outrage brigade hates, show that groups once considered oppressed, Jews, Japanese Americans, Chinese immigrants, often leapfrogged others economically within a generation or two. No massive redistribution program required, no apologies demanded, just, work, education, culture, and, dare we say, responsibility. Quotes you ought to tattoo on your brain from this chapter. The real question is not whether the rich are getting richer, but whether the poor are doing better, and they are. Statistical categories are not people. Income statistics are often snapshots of a moving picture. Every fallacy about income gets treated the same way in this chapter, strapped to a chair, interrogated under a merciless light, and left to rot when its lies are exposed. If you finish this chapter still clinging to your emotional arguments about inequality, congratulations, you have achieved a state of imperviousness to reality that would put a flat earther to shame. Key takeaway, the entire income debate is a bloated carcass of bad assumptions, misleading snapshots, and envious rhetoric. Real economic life is dynamic, not static. People move between income brackets. Rising living standards matter more than static envy. Wealth is created, not stolen. Chapter 6, Racial Facts and Fallacies. Sowell does not gently suggest that racial narratives are wrong. He kicks the door open and shouts it in your face. If you came looking for coddled feelings or progressive bedtime stories, you're in the wrong book. From the jump, Sowell obliterates the lazy assumption that all group differences in outcomes are the product of racism. Different outcomes are not only common, they are inevitable whenever groups differ in history, culture, geography, and demography. He starts by hammering home a simple but inconvenient fact. The ultimate test of any explanation is how well it fits the facts. You might want to embroider that on a pillow if you're a modern social scientist. Group differences in income, education, crime rates, and social standing have existed all over the world for centuries, and yes, even in places where everyone is of the same race. Japan's Burakumin minority and India's caste system didn't need white people or racism to create stunning disparities. Human societies have always produced inequalities based on countless factors other than pigmentation. Sowell slices through the "racism explains everything" crowd like a hot knife through butter. He points out that Jews, Chinese, Armenians, and Lebanese minorities have consistently been wealthier and more successful than the surrounding populations in places as diverse as Latin America, Southeast Asia, and Africa, often despite facing intense hostility. Yet when Black Americans have different outcomes, the immediate, unexamined answer is racism. How intellectually lazy can you get? He further dismantles the one-size-fits-all racism narrative by turning to history. Slavery is another sacred cow that Sowell mercilessly slaughters. Slavery wasn't uniquely American or even uniquely Western. It was a universal human institution. Africans enslaved Africans, Arabs enslaved Europeans, and Asians enslaved each other long before white Europeans got involved. What was unique, Sowell reminds us, was the West's later move to abolish slavery, often against bitter resistance from non-Western societies. He absolutely wrecks the narrative that America's past slavery explains today's black-white income gaps. If that were the case, Sowell asks, why did black incomes rise faster relative to whites between 1940 and 1960, before civil rights laws were passed, than they did afterward? Shouldn't the eradication of de jure racism have sped up black economic progress, not slowed it? But no, that messy little fact is wildly inconvenient for the progressive fairy tale, so it's quietly ignored. Turning to economics, Sowell goes after the myth that disparities in employment and earnings automatically signal discrimination. Black Americans and other minorities are often younger on average, and young people, regardless of race, earn less than older, more experienced workers. When you compare apples to apples, like married black men and married white men of the same age and experience, the wage gap shrinks dramatically. Education quality also matters enormously, and surprise, surprise, a diploma from a dysfunctional inner-city school isn't the same thing as one from a suburban district. Sowell has no patience for those who insist that years of education are a meaningful statistic without any attention to the content or quality of that education. He even dissects the so-called epidemic of racial discrimination by employers. If employers were truly obsessed with discriminating against minorities, he asks, why are Asian Americans, who were once savagely discriminated against, now outperforming whites in both income and education? Selective discrimination that somehow boosts Asians while hurting blacks is a magical theory that collapses under the slightest breeze of logic. Sowell's acid wit shows when he mocks the media and academia's role in perpetuating fallacies. He argues that emotional narratives are sold to the public precisely because they are emotionally satisfying, not because they are factually accurate. Moral melodramas, he calls them, providing simple heroes and villains so that people can pat themselves on the back without understanding a damn thing. And let's not pretend Sowell leaves hope hanging in the wind. He points out that racial progress in America has historically been driven far more by internal factors like improved education, family structure, and work habits than by government interventions or protest movements. In short, fix yourself first. Waiting around for societal perfection is the loser's game. Key quotes from Chapter 6. Disparities are as ubiquitous across human societies as rocks in a field, but rocks don't call for a cosmic explanation. Economic differences among racial or ethnic groups are not only common, but virtually inevitable. Those who believe that slavery explains all current black-white differences must explain why so many of these differences were smaller in times closer to the era of slavery. Key takeaway: blaming disparities solely on racism is intellectually lazy. Real-world outcomes among racial and ethnic groups are shaped far more by complex historical, cultural, economic, and demographic factors than by discrimination alone. Chapter 7. Third World Facts and Fallacies. If you thought Sowell was brutal before, wait until you see what he does to the hand-wringing, guilt-soaked mythology around the so-called Third World. Get ready, because he savagely deconstructs the delusion that the poverty of nations across Africa, Asia, and Latin America is simply the fault of exploitation by the West. No, Sowell has no patience for that high-minded nonsense, and he is not handing out participation trophies for economic failure. Right out of the gate, Sowell slams the whole exploitation narrative with this reality check. Wealth is not just taken, it must first be created. Exploitation theorists, he sneers, act as if wealth simply exists like apples on a tree, ready to be plucked by whichever colonial hand is the fastest. In reality, countries like Britain became rich not because they looted the world, but because they developed institutions, incentives, and human capital that fostered innovation and productivity at home. Meanwhile, many of the so-called victims were stagnant long before a European ever showed up. Sowell absolutely guts the idea that the Third World was on a glorious economic path that was derailed by imperialism. No, he says, much of the world was shockingly backward before Western contact, technologically, educationally, and institutionally. Sub-Saharan Africa had no written languages, wheeled vehicles, or stone buildings before European arrival. These are not value judgments, they are facts that are wildly inconvenient for people who prefer to wallow in anti-Western guilt. Sowell also demolishes the myth that geography is just a footnote. Geography, he explains, has been a brutal, merciless force shaping human societies. Tropical regions, for instance, suffer from diseases like malaria and parasites that destroy human capital before it can even form. Tropical agriculture is less productive. Transportation is vastly harder without navigable rivers like Europe's Rhine or Danube. But sure, let's just blame the West, because facing uncomfortable physical realities is too hard for pampered moralists in ivory towers. Turning to history, Sowell again refuses to indulge fantasies. Colonialism, he admits, was often brutal, but the idea that independence has universally improved things is laughable. Many African and Asian nations regressed into chaos, corruption, and economic collapse after Europeans left. Botswana, which maintained decent governance and basic property rights, became one of the fastest growing economies in the world after independence. Zimbabwe, meanwhile, turned itself from Africa's breadbasket into a starving authoritarian mess. It's not colonialism or neocolonialism or any other magic word that made the difference. It was governance, incentives, and human capital. But good luck getting that message through to the grievance industry. In economics, Sowell rips into another beloved fallacy, that rich countries are rich because they somehow robbed poor countries of their natural resources. This would be laughable if it weren't so tragically persistent. Countries like Switzerland and Japan, which have virtually no natural resources, became powerhouses. Meanwhile, nations dripping in oil, gold, and diamonds, like Venezuela, Nigeria, and the Congo, have often wallowed in dysfunction and poverty. Sowell points out that natural resources have often been a curse rather than a blessing. They attract corruption, foster rent-seeking behavior, and often breed conflict rather than prosperity. Another blow Sowell delivers is to the foreign aid industry. If throwing money at poor countries were the answer, then after decades and billions of dollars, Africa should be a shimmering paradise by now. Instead, aid has often propped up kleptocratic regimes, distorted local economies, and delayed real development. As Sowell puts it, foreign aid has often served to subsidize the mistakes of local governments while at the same time shielding them from the consequences of their own policies. He doesn't sugarcoat it. Pouring money into dysfunctional political systems is like pouring gasoline on a dumpster fire. Throughout this chapter, Sowell's writing is a masterclass in confrontation. He refuses to flatter, refuses to apologize, refuses to pretend that reality is optional. His examples are sharp, his tone unsparing, and his disdain for fashionable ignorance practically drips off every page. He even takes a moment to rip into trendy buzzwords like economic imperialism, mocking the idea that corporations investing in the third world are somehow committing crimes by creating jobs and building infrastructure. He points out that when foreign companies leave, wages collapse, unemployment soars, and people who once had incomes are thrown back into subsistence. The final twist of the knife comes when Sowell makes a devastatingly simple point. Progress requires painful changes. Japan didn't become a modern economic power by clinging to samurai swords and feudal hierarchy. It tore itself away from traditionalism, embraced Western science and education, and clawed its way into the modern world. The harsh truth, Sowell says, is that cultures which refuse to change, adapt, and innovate will remain poor, and no amount of guilt from wealthy countries will change that. Key quotes from Chapter 7. What matters fundamentally is not the ownership of natural resources, but the ability to develop human resources. Neither geography, colonialism, nor exploitation by foreigners can explain why poor countries remain poor decade after decade when others, starting from similarly dire circumstances, have risen. The third world was not always a victim. Sometimes it was simply a laggard. Key takeaway. Third world poverty is not the West's fault. It stems overwhelmingly from internal factors like geography, governance, culture, and the hard choices societies make, or refuse to make, to develop their own human capital and institutions. Chapter 8. Parting Thoughts. If you thought Thomas Sowell was going to slow down, take a deep breath, and end on some kumbaya group hug about understanding our differences, you obviously haven't been paying attention. In Parting Thoughts, Sowell drops the gloves completely. He practically leans across the table, grabs the reader by the shirt collar and roars, "Wake up! Stop being stupid! Stop letting pretty words hide ugly realities." Sowell's parting message is brutal. The world is full of fallacies because it is full of people who desperately want to believe fallacies. And the more fashionable, emotional, or high-sounding the fallacy, the less likely it is anyone will dare challenge it. Welcome to modern public discourse, where intellectual cowardice is sold as compassion and ignorance is virtue signaled like it's a damn Nobel Prize. One of Sowell's first strikes in this final chapter is against the idea that all we need are good intentions. He hammers the point that intentions are meaningless without results. It's not enough to feel sorry for the poor, the marginalized, or the third world. Policies must actually work, and far too often they don't. Quoting him directly, "The road to hell is paved with Ivy League degrees." Why? Because, Sowell says, the people crafting policies are often insulated from the consequences of their ideas. They live in gated communities, send their kids to private schools, and when their utopian social engineering blows up real lives in real communities, they get promoted, write memoirs, and give TED Talks about rethinking the very disasters they caused. They are never held accountable. Those who are insulated from reality can afford to indulge in illusions. He returns again to his central theme throughout the book. Knowledge is localized, fragmented, and painfully hard to aggregate. No bureaucrat, professor, or social crusader has enough knowledge to redesign vast, complex human systems like education, housing, or labor markets from the top down. Attempts to do so inevitably end in chaos, usually for the poor, never for the compassionate elites patting themselves on the back for caring. Sowell also goes after the perpetual infantilization of minorities and the poor. He rips apart the idea that whole groups need to be treated like helpless victims who can't possibly survive without the benevolent interference of self-appointed saviors. Human beings are not chess pieces to be moved about on a board, he says, a sharp callback to the chess pieces fallacy he dissected earlier in the book. Every time some policy is justified by the notion that disadvantaged groups can't help themselves, Sowell sees condescension of the worst sort, a lethal combination of arrogance and ignorance. He absolutely detests the idea that progress can only happen if experts intervene. Historically, he reminds us, people have dragged themselves up through their own efforts. their own cultural norms, and their own painfully built institutions, not through pity from outsiders. One of the hardest hitting arguments he makes here is about trade-offs. The world is not filled with perfect solutions, it is filled with messy, ugly trade-offs. Policies should not be judged by whether they solve a problem completely, because nothing ever does, but whether they make things better or worse than the available alternatives. Every time someone demands justice or equity without understanding what is being sacrificed to achieve it, they are living in Fantasyland, and Fantasyland is bankrupt. Sowell blasts the idiocy of thinking about economics, social policy, or international relations in terms of morality plays with clear-cut heroes and villains. The world is infinitely more complicated. It is much easier to construct a vision of the world as the result of villains doing wrong than to understand the intricate and sometimes tragic interactions of different individuals and groups operating under constraints. People aren't just good or evil. They are human, and they respond to incentives, constraints, and opportunities. Sowell's final attack is on the anti-intellectualism of the so-called intellectuals. That's right, the very people who wrap themselves in big words, flowery language, and empty rhetoric are often the dumbest when it comes to basic cause and effect reality. Seldom is there much demand for evidence when fashionable theories are involved, Sowell points out. And in those rare moments when evidence actually is demanded, it is often dismissed if it doesn't fit the prevailing narrative. Confirmation bias is not an occasional glitch, it's the main operating system of ideological crusades. The ultimate message of Parting Thoughts is simple, savage, and brilliant. Stop worshipping pretty words. Stop excusing failure. Stop pretending good intentions erase bad outcomes. Face the hard truths. Sowell doesn't want your tears, he wants your brain switched on. He ends not with uplift, but with confrontation, an open dare to the reader to stay awake, think independently, and have the spine to call out fashionable nonsense even when, especially when, it makes you unpopular. Key quotes from Chapter 8. The road to hell is paved with Ivy League degrees. Those who are insulated from reality can afford to indulge in illusions. Human beings are not chess pieces to be moved about on a board. It is much easier to construct a vision of the world as the result of villains doing wrong than to understand the intricate and sometimes tragic interactions of different individuals and groups operating under constraints. Good intentions provide no protection from bad outcomes. Key takeaway: reality is brutal, messy, and full of trade-offs. True compassion demands ruthless realism, not pretty lies, and no amount of fashionable rhetoric can substitute for the hard, often painful work of thinking clearly and demanding results, not intentions. Conclusion. Thomas Sowell's economic facts and fallacies could be boiled down to a single battle cry. It would be this: wake up or get crushed by reality. This is not a book for the faint-hearted, the delicate, or the self-satisfied virtue signalers who think mouthing slogans makes them smart. Sowell dismantles the cozy myths that dominate popular thinking about poverty, race, education, gender, cities, income, and the third world, with a merciless combination of data, history, economics, and sheer intellectual force. He doesn't ask for your agreement, he demands your honesty. Throughout every chapter, Sowell dares to point out what the chattering classes fear most. Many of the world's biggest problems are caused not by villains plotting evil, but by ordinary people clinging to comforting illusions. He smashes the idea that noble intentions excuse disastrous results. He wipes out the fairy tale that you can re-engineer society from the top down without catastrophic, unintended consequences. He exposes, again and again, that the most dangerous lies are the ones we tell ourselves, usually dressed up as compassion, progress, or justice. The truth Sowell slaps across the reader's face again and again is this: good intentions provide no protection from bad outcomes. That's it. That's the hard, ugly, necessary lesson. Reality doesn't care how much you care. It doesn't care how many slogans you chant. Results matter, evidence matters, thinking matters, and fashionable ignorance, no matter how popular, is still ignorance. This book is not just worth reading, it's worth memorizing, arguing over, shouting from rooftops, and slamming down on the table in the middle of smug, self-congratulatory conversations. If you're tired of being spoon-fed fairy tales by politicians, professors, activists, and media hacks, Economic Facts and Fallacies will arm you with the intellectual ammo you need. Buy this book, not because it's trendy, not because it will make you feel good, but because it will make you think, and thinking clearly is the first and last true act of rebellion in a world drowning in comforting lies.